Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's discussion of the annual report on American giving, recently published by the Giving USA Foundation and its research partner, the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University. Although it's now a...
Cool.
Is it the School of Philanthropy? No, what is it called?
Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.
Okay. What he said. A special welcome to our live streaming viewers coming to us from the websites of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the Nonprofit Quarterly, and the Curtis Group. Curtis Group is, yes, you've plugged us in. The latest Giving USA estimate covering the year 2012 is now the latest plot point in a line that stretches back over 50 years. It is widely acknowledged to be the most authoritative and comprehensive estimate available for giving in the United States. It is, therefore, our honor once again this year, the fourth year in a row, for the Bradley Center to co-sponsor today's event with Giving USA Foundation and Indiana's Center on Philanthropy in order to discuss the implications of this year's estimate in the heart of the nation's capital. We've assembled a distinguished panel to do so, including representatives of the organizations behind the numbers. If you're overwhelmed by a sense of deja vu at this point, it's because we've been able to assemble precisely the same panel of experts for each of these annual discussions. Indeed, my opening remarks here are exactly the same as last year's, including the reference to deja vu, which may induce a severe case of vertigo for some of you, and I apologize about that. But my sole duty is to introduce the person who will introduce the others and moderate the panel. We're proud to welcome as our moderator today, Stacy Palmer. Stacy is the founding editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the journal of record for the world of foundations, and is a frequent conference speaker and widely cited expert on the topic of nonprofits and foundations. So it's a pleasure to have you back as our moderator. Stacy.
Thank you. You said deja vu. I was thinking it was Groundhog Day, because not only is it the same panel that's talking to you, but also we have sort of similar results going on. And I wish that we could say giving had increased 10%, and we will all be back here at this table when we can say that there has been tremendous growth, because we all look forward to that. But that's not the state of the nonprofit world today. I'm curious, for those of you who work at nonprofit organizations, do you have a sense of how your own organization did? How many groups here saw an increase in giving last year? That's pretty good, actually, because I've been doing some polling like that at other groups that have been talking about Giving USA, and is sometimes no hands go up about seeing an increase at all. And somebody came over to me the other day and said, I was too embarrassed to put my hand up. We actually had an increase, but I'm not sure I should say so these days. So that gives you a sense of the mindset that's going on in the world of philanthropy right now. It's tough times, and as a result of that, the Nonprofit Finance Fund just did a survey that found that 40% of all nonprofits are looking for another way to raise money other than what they're doing now. Everybody's scrambling to look for different ways to go after this money because it's not growing in a very big way. But the lack of growth is something that philanthropy needs to pay attention to. And as you can see in the issues that are on your chairs, one of the questions we asked is, what would it take to be able to get giving to increase in a really significant way? Instead of being 2% of GDP, how about 3% of GDP? What would it really take? And fortunately, Patrick had one of the easiest answers for anybody to get their hands around, and it's simple for anybody to do. And he has brought his prop, which I very much appreciate. $5 a day. If you didn't have this Starbucks, gave it to charity, $220 billion could be given to nonprofits. So a new movement. Everybody skip your Starbucks or other favorite drink, give it to charity, and think of the power of what the nonprofit world could do. There are more solutions and other ideas in the paper to explore. I hope we'll talk about those bigger issues as well as just what happened in the past year in our panel. And I will turn it over to Patrick to tell us what really happened last year.
Okay. Thanks, Stacey.
I do want to say that I have nothing against Starbucks, and I love their product, and I have to salute a company that spends more money on health insurance for their employees than they do the coffee beans, which is the thing that they're the most famous for. So, but I think to Stacy's larger point, what's the value-added proposition? What would it take to move the dial? And as we're going to see, the dial hasn't been moved in the last several years. And so this is something that I've asked as a rhetorical question and comment for a number of years. And I've used Starbucks because for those of you who have ever bought a Starbucks, and those of you who buy it every day, you can understand where you could easily spend $5 a day in frivolous consumption. So it's the $5 a day in frivolous consumption that I want to point to that would double household giving overnight, not picking on Starbucks per se, but it's a useful heuristic prop that I think everybody understands. Well, the last time I was here, Bill's right, that we were the Center on Philanthropy, and in this last year, the Center on Philanthropy has been transformed into the world's first school of philanthropy. And we're proudly named after the Lilly family. It's the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And so this is the 13th year that we have done this with Giving USA, and it's a great partnership. And I want to say thank you to Wendy and the Giving USA and Giving Institute member firms. But it's, I think it's been a wonderful partnership, and we've worked hard at making this better. Now, a couple years ago, I went to a speech coach because everybody said, you do a pretty good job at this, but you have no humor, and you have too much data, and you go too fast, and oh yeah, and you have no humor. So they said, put it in some pictures. So here's a picture. Now back to work. So here's a little different display for the pie chart that we've always used for Giving USA on the sources and uses. And this, you can give us feedback if you like this or not, but I think this is easier to read myself. Households, so the big number, 316 billion, I'm sorry, I should have started with that. Last year, we estimated that households, corporations, and foundations cumulatively gave $316.2 billion, okay? That's up 3.5% from a year ago in nominal dollars, and about 1.5% after you adjust for inflation, which was about 2% last year, okay? Individuals gave $229 billion, 72%. Their market share has actually declined a little bit, but that's not because we don't think that households are giving less, but rather they're giving more of their dollars through foundations, which has seen an increase in market share to $46 billion or 15%. Charitable bequests, 7% at $23.4 billion. When you add in the charitable bequest giving to the inter vivos giving, when you add in the fact that 45% of foundation grant making comes from family foundations where the families are still making the decisions, 87% of all the dollars given last year were given by individuals and their families through one checkbook or another or through their estate. So when you think about this from a fundraising perspective, it's very important that we think about the relationships and the connections to the organizations with the families. And I would also add, our other research shows that women play a very important role in philanthropy. And so if you are a fundraiser, don't just go to the male, even if you think that they have the biggest earning capacity in that household, the women play a very important role. And don't ignore the kids, because the next generation is playing an increasingly important role as well. One of the things that's new in this year's result is that corporations accounted for 6% of total giving. That's up. Most years they're at 4 or 5%, so they've increased their market share, and we'll talk about that a little bit more detail in a second. Where'd the money go? Well, as always, religion is the dominant share, 32%. That market share is down, though, from the last 20 years, the last 40 years, and you'll see this as we look. The market share 20 years ago and 50 years ago would have been 50% or 55%. So we can see a fairly rapid, pardon the pun, secular trend down. This is not because giving to religious organizations is generally going down, although it has in the last 2 of the last 3 years in inflation-adjusted dollars, but rather because giving to religious organizations is growing more slowly than giving to secular charities. And we can talk more about that in a few minutes. Education and human services are tied neck and neck at 13% of the pie. Now, this is Ruth's favorite part. The fourth runner-up is giving to foundations at 10% of the pie. And I think she may comment on that later. But one of the things about gifts to foundations to keep in mind is even though many of us as charities would like to receive those endowment gifts in our own charitable endowment base, those gifts are going into the philanthropic sector in perpetuity. And so they will continue to support the nonprofit sector for many years to come. Health, 9%. One of the things that will be interesting to track over time is what is the impact of Obamacare. There's lots of interesting things to track about that, but what will be the impact of Obamacare and other changes in healthcare on philanthropic giving to healthcare? Historically, the subsectors that have had more rapid growth in federal support have had slower growth in private philanthropic support. So we'll see if this trend continues going forward. Public society benefit are donor advice funds, United Ways, Jewish federations, and things like that, the Federated Campaign. These are all the combined funds. The donor advice funds, the four largest donor advice funds last year grew 77% year over year in their asset base. Pretty extraordinary growth, which suggests that some of the other federated funds are probably not growing as rapidly. International at 6%. When we first started tracking international in 1987, that was less than 2%. So that has seen fairly rapid growth in market share. Arts and culture, 5%. Environment, 3%. Unallocated, 2%. Unallocated is a combination of things, measurement error between the sources and uses, but it's also things like if you give a gift to a charity that's too small, it doesn't register with the IRS, or if you make a charitable remainder trust, the charity may not know about it right away and things like that. So there are things that don't show up necessarily in the IRS. Gifts to individuals, 1%. This is, we've started tracking this for the last couple of years. These are primarily gifts of discounted or free drugs from pharmaceuticals directly to individuals. Okay? So as we'll see, that this is gone from 0 to 1% over the last couple of years. All right, let's look at a 2-year change. These are in inflation-adjusted dollars, in part because we've had inflation in the last couple of years, but I think once you go back to more than 1 year, inflation starts playing a more meaningful role, and we want to pay attention to this. Total giving for the last 2 years, 2.5%. So is the glass half full or is it half empty? The half full piece says, hey, giving has grown the last 3 years. It's not going down. Glass half empty, giving has grown only 2.5% in inflation-adjusted dollars the last 2 years. So one of the things that when we were talking to Holly Hall at the Chronicle about what does this mean, one of the things we estimated was that it would take another 6 years of growth of giving at the last 2 years average to reach where we were before the Great Recession began. Okay? Now, put that in context. In every recession, except for the 73, 75 OPEC-induced oil embargo-related recession, it's taken 1 or at most 2 years to get back to where we were before the recession began. The OPEC-induced recession took 3 years to get back to where we were. We are now 3 years out of that recession, the Great Recession, and we're nowhere near where we are. We're nowhere near today where we were in 2007. In fact, we're 8 percentage points below where we were then. So the glass half empty piece is we've got a ways to go just to get back to where we were. And that's not to say that these numbers are sacrosanct and that we have to be where we were in 2007 or anything like that. But it does suggest that, particularly in a time of a weak economy and sluggish growth and stubbornly high unemployment, that there are many constituencies who are not being served. People who are hungry or homeless who nonprofits could serve better. People who could be trained better for jobs and so on. Kids who could get scholarships and so on. This slow growth is mostly driven by the slow growth in household giving. Household giving has grown 2% in the last 2 years. Again, that's great news that it's growing. Household giving fell the most precipitously during the Great Recession, and so we're happy and gratified to see that growing, but still relatively slowly. Foundation grant making has grown 6.1% combined the last 2 years. Bequest giving, excuse me, you can look at this. It fell 9% in inflation-adjusted dollars 2 years ago. Am I not on? Thank you. Bequest giving fell dramatically last year from 2 years ago, and 2 years had grown dramatically from the year before. Now, there's lots of people who die and leave an estate, and there's lots of charitable bequests that come out of that. But every year what we find is the 4 or 5 or the 1 or 2 largest estates make the difference as to whether or not charitable bequest giving goes up or goes down that year. Okay, so 2 years ago, there was one estate that was conservatively estimated to be 2.5 billion with a B. Bequest giving went up 10% that year, effectively, in nominal dollars. You take that out of the equation, so bequest giving is then down 10% this last year, and then you add in a little growth from smaller estates, and it did not go down the full 10%. Corporate giving up almost 10% in inflation-adjusted dollars, went up over 12% in nominal dollars. This is pretty remarkable, and it's largely driven by the growth in corporate profitability. I think one of the challenges that we face is, though, again, corporate giving is still a relatively small share of the total pie, and so even though we've had fantastic growth in corporate giving the last year, it still did not drive total giving as much. Religious giving, what happened over the last 2 years? Religious giving over the last 2 years fell 1.1% in inflation-adjusted dollars. In 2 out of the last 3 years, giving to religious organizations declined in absolute terms. In the last decade, giving to religious organizations has been very stagnant, growing slowly in some years, falling slowly in other years. And this is a change, I think, from the long-term trend in which giving to religious organizations has grown slowly but steadily in good times and in bad. Now, I'm not making a moral judgment about this being good or bad or evil or what's driving this, but we do know that if households are not attending mass, mosque, synagogue, or other organized services, they tend not to give to religious organizations. And we also know from other research that each generation is attending mass, mosque, synagogue less often than their parents and their grandparents. Okay? And this goes back to the silent generation during the Great Depression. So this is a very long wave pattern. Education has grown fairly dramatically last year, 5.2% in the last 2 years combined in inflation-adjusted dollars. The stock market is the single best predictor of what's going to happen to giving to education. Thankfully, somebody who occasionally raises money for a university, donors like it when the stock market goes up, and they feel grateful to their alma mater, and they often give large gifts. Human services, we've seen has grown fairly rapidly during the Great Recession compared to other subsectors and coming out of it, but we're starting to see that stale out a little bit and stagnate a little bit. It's just fairly flat the last 2 years combined. Excuse me. Giving to foundations went down pretty dramatically last year. One of the things that we know is that the stock market went up over 13% last year, and we're a little surprised that giving to foundations did not go up in a parallel manner. But keep in mind that giving to foundations is an irreversible gift. So I might put money in my savings account and move it to my checking account and vice versa, but once I put it into a foundation, that's irreversible. Okay, that's a permanent gift. And so I think some individuals, some high net worth donors were looking to see, is this recovery going to be sustained at a higher level, or is this going to continue to plow through? Is the stock market recovery going to be sustained at a higher level, or are we in for a correction? Health, 3% for the last 2 years. Again, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we've seen historically is that giving to subsectors like health and human services, where the federal government expenses have grown more rapidly, are generally correlated with slower growth in private philanthropic support, and giving federal spending on international and on environment, which has grown more slowly than other subsectors, has seen more rapid growth in the last couple decades, and it'll be interesting to see what impact the Obamacare has on giving to health in the longer term. Public society benefit has grown fairly robustly the last 2 years, and again, that's been largely driven by gifts to donor advice funds. We may hear more about that from other panelists. Ruth, that's your hint. International affairs has grown very robustly the last 2 years, but last year not so much, and that's because, in part, because there was not a major international natural disaster that attracted a lot of attention. Arts and culture had actually declined in inflation-adjusted dollars 2 years ago and grew very robustly this last year. One of the things that we think is going on is donors are returning to the status quo where they had given larger to arts and culture, environment, and international than they had. Excuse me. I'm going to grab my Starbucks. Pardon me, Stacy.
$1 for charity. It's lost.
Missed opportunity.
Yep.
But one of the things that, arts and culture took a pretty big hit during the Great Recession. In fact, we heard donors say to us and to other charities, we're not giving major gifts to you this year because we need to feed the hungry and house the homeless. At the same time, as we have started to recover and things have stabilized, albeit slowly, arts and culture took a nice uptick. Environment similarly took a 4% growth in the last 2 years, but most of that last year as well. This histogram shows the dark blue lines are growth in real dollars of total giving in non-recessionary years, growth years, and the light blue lines in the histogram are growth in giving or changes in giving during recessionary years. One of the things that you can see during the Great Recession is that giving did in fact plummet in both nominal dollars and inflation-adjusted dollars. This is the first time that giving declined in nominal dollars because of the business cycle in history. Okay, so it's truly remarkable, and it's remarkable that it declined so much. Now you can see, we are recovering. We see an uptick, and this has been sustained for the last 3 years. So again, that's the good news. That's the glass half full. But you can also see that we're still substantially below where we were in 2007 before the Great Recession began. Individual giving, again, you can see business cycle effects throughout this, but they're very pronounced following the 2001-2002 recession, and even more pronounced during the Great Recession. Giving by foundations, fairly flat growth leading up to the tech boom in the mid-1990s, and has really taken off since then. And I would say the remarkable story here is that this has been sustained at fairly higher and higher levels throughout the last 20 years, but you do see business cycle effects, especially during the Great Recession. You may have heard me say before that this slide is perhaps my nightmare slide as somebody trying to do forecasting. It's pretty easy to forecast a nice smooth trend. It's pretty hard to forecast a yo-yo movement like this. And I think that one of the challenges is, again, a few of the largest estates make the difference as to whether or not the total bequest giving is going up or going down. And this last year, we did not have any huge estates closing, so we had a little downturn. Gifts by corporations. Corporate profitability last year and the year before is the largest driver of corporate giving, and changes in the overall economy is the second largest driver of changes in corporate giving. And so you can see, not surprisingly, a huge business cycle effect. One of the things we'll see coming up, though, is that corporations are giving more, but they're not giving a larger share of their profits. And so I think this is also a challenge for those of us in the nonprofit sector. If you look at, these are 5-year bandwidths for the sources of giving. And I think one of the interesting phenomenon is, if you go back to 40 years ago, household giving was 82% of the pie, and now it's 72%. You go back 40 years ago, corporate giving was 4.2%, now it's 5.1% for the last 5 years. But the big driver, the big change has really been changes in foundation grant making, which has grown from 6.6 to 14.4%. most of that has been manifested in family foundations. So families creating new family foundations and investing additional assets in that. So I would argue that much of this decline in the household giving is actually not a decline in household giving, it's just a different manifestation of that. So Stacy mentioned the how do we give more and what would it take, but this graphic really I think is a challenge for those of us in the nonprofit sector. We've been stuck at 2% of GDP, total giving as a share of GDP for the last several years, and if you track this back and scale that up from 0 to 100, it would basically be a straight line at 2%. Okay, so we make a big deal about if it goes up or goes down, but it's really not going up or down. It's operating in a fairly narrow bandwidth. And so what would it take to move from 2% of GDP to a higher number? Similarly, you look at household giving. We've been stuck at 1.9% for the last several years of household giving as a percentage of disposable personal income. And disposable just means after tax. That's not after paying your bills or paying your mortgage. It's just after tax dollars, okay? Corporate giving, the long-term, the 40-year rate is 0.9%, so just under 1%. For the last several years, we've bounced around 0.8%. So while corporate giving increased over 12% last year in nominal dollars, its share of total corporate profitability is still fairly low. Okay, again, I'm not judging, I'm just making an observation. I'll leave it to Ruth to judge. I mentioned earlier that if you look at this, the piece of the pies over time, going back to the far left and for the first 20 or 25 years in here, about half or more of total giving went to religious organizations, and now it's down to about a third. Education has bounced around, but it's stayed pretty steady at 13%. Human services has increased and decreased, but it's been around 13% for some time. Giving to foundations wasn't even tracked 40 years ago and has grown from 5% to over 10% in the last decade or so, and on down the line. One of the things that it's harder to see because the segments are small, but environment, when we first started tracking that at 1%, is now almost 3%, and international, when we first started tracking that at just under 2%, is now over 6%. So as a market share, those two subsectors have dramatically increased their pieces of the pie. Now, Tommy talked more about this in his segment, so I don't want to take up too much time here. But one of the things that we've seen is the number of charities has grown pretty dramatically. A couple years ago, the IRS kind of cleaned up their mailing list. More technical than that. But the net effect is a couple 100,000 charities were wiped off the slates, not necessarily because they went broke during the Great Recession. We think that it really was more that these were charities that had gone out of business a long time ago, and they were just taken off the rolls during this time period. But you can see there's over 1 million, about 1.1 million registered 501c3s. This does not include an estimated another 350,000 religious charities that are not required to file with the IRS. All right, I've got to put in a plug. Please download your products for free. I will say this is not a great business model. We're giving away the key results for free. We're trying to raise money with the Giving USA Foundation to help support this project. But at the same time, there's a lot of useful information there. And there are some things that are there for free, and there are other things that are deeper dives that you actually have to pay. But we're using internet pricing. Everything's very cheap. So thank you, and I'll be around for questions.
Thank you. To continue giving this global view of what's going on in the nonprofit world, Tom Pollock will talk about what he's finding. He's from the Urban Institute.
Thank you, Stacy. Originally, we talked about giving Patrick 15 minutes, but as you can see, that just would not have sufficed. So I will talk a little bit about the nonprofit sector and the broader financial context, and then I will hazard my own opinions about how to dramatically increase giving at the close. keep in mind that the $300+ billion in charitable giving to the nonprofit sector actually only represents around 13% of the total revenue of public charities and private foundations, the so-called 501c3 organizations. The role of private contributions varies dramatically depending upon the sector. It's down in the single digits as a percentage of total revenue for segments like healthcare and hospitals. It's nearing 70% for international development and somewhere in between for other sectors. The dominant source of revenue remains program service revenue overall. So that's your college tuition, your payments at your local hospitals, your ticket prices at your arts museums and theaters. All that plays a huge role in the finances of the nonprofit sector. Before talking more about the finances, let me just sort of follow up on Patrick's last couple slides on the growth of the sector. We just finished a brief, which I'll make available to you at the front after this session. So looking at the births and deaths in the nonprofit sector over the past 8-10 years, and all in all, the sector actually made it through the Great Recession surprisingly well in terms of so births and deaths. Just looking at the past 2 years, in 2011, we had 41,000 public charities being created, newly registering with the IRS, and nearly 2,500 new private foundations. The numbers obtaining recognition from the IRS were down slightly in the past year, just 5 or 6%. We don't know if that reflects a real trend in terms of activity on the ground, or it may just be attributable to delays in the registration process at the IRS that all of you may know much more about than you ever thought you would. So let me talk a little bit about private contributions and the overall revenue picture in the sector and for different subsectors. Unfortunately, NCCS, the National Center for Charitable Statistics at the Urban Institute, we don't have as fresh a data set as Patrick uses for the Giving USA numbers. What we have is preliminary numbers, so leading indicators from approximately 1/3 of the public charities and private foundations. What we have is basically the total revenue or gross receipts of the organizations in fiscal year 2012, and what we can do is kind of compare that broadly with how those same organizations performed a year earlier. And once again, continuing our pattern of using the same kind of analysis in previous years, I'll talk about the big winners and big losers from year to year. So what we see is that in the arts sector, for example, we had 31% of organizations reporting at least a 10% decline in gross receipts between 2011 and 2012. In contrast, we had around 36% of the same organizations reporting increases of 10% or more. So overall, what we see is about 5% of organizations reporting larger increases than reported declines, with around 1/3 of the organizations more or less static in their revenue. So overall, it's I'd say a picture of health with kind of a normal level of churning in the middle, but overall the sector seems to be doing well. We pretty much see the same pattern in all the subsectors. There are a few that show slightly larger results than others. Higher education, for example, we have a much larger percentage of winners than losers. So around 33% reported gains of 10% or more in revenue, compared to only around 1/5 that reported losses of 10% or more. Other substantial numbers, human services, once again, we had a much higher number of organizations reporting big increases than big losses. For most of the other sectors, the numbers were, slightly up, but only by a few percentage points. I think overall, I think these findings are certainly consistent with Patrick's numbers, but I'd say lead us to conclude that the other sources of nonprofit revenue, like program service revenue and investment income, which actually represents less than 5% of total revenue for public charities, all those are contributing to sort of a positive growth in the sector. Turning now to my thoughts on how to increase giving. A lot of my work over the past couple of years has been focused on helping local communities and people at a state level work together more effectively, starting through the nonprofit sector and through our what we call our community platform project. My favorite statistic remains giving and volunteering in Utah, which is nearly twice as high as comparable statistics in every other state, depending upon what particular measure of giving and volunteering you look at. That, to me, sort of consistent with Patrick's thoughts, does tell us that Americans certainly can give and volunteer much more. I'm less optimistic, however, about the possibilities of getting there by merely techniques and giving days and some of the other sort of approaches that have really been sort of all the rage over the past 5 years or so in the nonprofit sector. I think the real challenge for us moving forward is how do you really create a different kind of civic culture where leaders are trusted at a local level, where nonprofits are more highly trusted, and where the average person on the street is seeing sort of tangible evidence of nonprofit leaders and civic leaders acting selflessly in the public interest, both as measured by their compensation levels as well as by their ability to work collectively together. I don't think it's a short-term project, and I by no means would dismiss these sort of efforts like giving days and getting people to forego their cups of Starbucks coffee for the day. But I think to some extent it's like we're building a better hot air balloon, and what we really need to be doing is thinking about the long-term task of how do you help communities work better together? How do you help them really fly? And I think until we can sort of manage that much more difficult tasks of building the civic skills and civic knowledge and so habits of the heart, I don't think we'll really get to where we want to go. So, thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And I think you suggested probably another panel that Bill should lead on how we actually do those things. So that's probably coming up next, I'll bet. The next section of our panel, we're going to talk about what it's really like on the ground for fundraisers and nonprofits and get that real-world perspective of what's going on. Wendy McGrady of the Curtis Group will be next.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon. I'm Wendy McGrady. As Stacy said, I'm Vice President of the Curtis Group, which is a fundraising consulting firm headquartered in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. Our firm is a member of the Giving Institute, which, as Patrick said, in partnership with Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, publishes, our sister organization, Giving USA, publishes Giving USA. So we are happy to be a part of this panel once again, and I think after 4 years, we've all comfortably settled into our roles as panelists. Patrick, Tom presenting the numbers, me saying, so what do we do with them? And Ruth commenting maybe on what ought to be happening differently. I'm not sure. I'll let you define that for us today, Ruth. But I did want to say we're happy to be here today and to talk a little bit about what you may be interested in, and that is what to do with these numbers. How many of you are directly involved in fundraising for your organizations? Okay, so about a third of this room, and likely many of you joining us by video. I think it's particularly important for those of you who are on the ground, as Stacy said, in thinking about what strategies, tactics to employ to address these numbers. You've heard today, giving is up 3.5%. Oh, and as an aside, I use current dollars, whereas Patrick uses inflation-adjusted dollars, because I work with organizations like yours every day, and generally they're talking about how much money they raised today over last year. So I talk in current dollars. So the numbers are up 3.5% over last year. Current, steady growth, the economic indicators all pointing us in the right direction, but slow, steady growth. So maybe it is going to take another 6 years to completely recover those 2007 pre-recession numbers. But until then, what are we doing? How are we addressing the situation? Think, if you will, for a few minutes about the sources that Patrick talked about, where the money is coming from. The individual piece of that pie chart does not change greatly over the years. This year it's 72%, and when you add to that bequests at 7%, and then half of that foundation piece, because as Patrick said, 46% of foundation giving is family foundation. So when you add all those individual dollars together, you're at 86% of the dollars given in this country coming from individuals. 86%. So almost 9 out of every $10 given is being given by an individual. If you want to boil that down even further, high net worth individuals that represent about 4% of the households in our country give over 50% of those individual dollars. So if we're all stretched for resources and we're trying to decide where do we devote our time and energy, those relationships with individuals, and more specifically high net worth individuals, are probably worth the thought. That group of high net worth individuals, keep in mind, gives 95% of that group gives, whereas 65% of the general population gives. So again, if you have to choose where you're spending time and resources, how are you reaching out? And the question that a lot of people ask is, okay, well, how do I reach those people? How are you reaching those people? Have you engaged your leadership, your board members, in reaching out to those donors and cultivating them, stewarding them if you already have them? How are you developing relationships with those people? Fundraising has got to be about relationships and not transactions. If we're doing this right, we're not interested in this one gift, securing this one gift. We're interested in long-term, somebody or some family or some organization that's going to give to us multiple times, not just today. So how are we connecting with those individuals, those corporations? There are more choices than ever before. Both Patrick and Tom talked about the number of nonprofit organizations. There are 1.1 million nonprofits in this country, so there are a lot of choices. And in your geographic area only, think of other organizations that have similar missions, similar programs. There's overlap. So how are you distinguishing and differentiating your organization? Do you have a tight, compelling message that you, your staff, your leaders, your board can articulate to clearly differentiate what you're doing and help you garner the support that you need? I mentioned your board. Your board are the connectors to the community. So how are you choosing your board? We work with people every day that's one of their largest concerns, is getting the right board members involved so that they can connect to those individuals, those high net worth individuals that I've mentioned. People are giving very strategically. Back in 07, 08, we saw high net worth individuals consolidating their giving to fewer organizations, maybe the same amount, but fewer organizations. And that trend has not redirected. So there has been a consolidation. And so the question for you is, how do you remain one of those philanthropic priorities and not get dropped off the list? In addition to narrowing their focus, donors like choices. Donor-advised funds have already been mentioned here today. And while it's important to note that of what's being given, only about 3% of that is given through donor-advised funds. So it's still a small percentage, but it's growing very rapidly. So people donors like the option of giving through donor advised funds. What that means for you as staff and as recipient of those funds is you have to work a little harder to connect with those donors. It's not as easy when you receive the money from a fund as it is if you receive it directly. But what it also means for you is receiving money through a fund like that often indicates a pool that is there for the future where money could be given again. So the effort that you put into that will likely pay off. Donor behavior shifts as the environment changes. We've seen the numbers this morning that seem to indicate a return to pre-recession priorities, if you will. Arts, education, environment, animals, those sectors that are highly dependent on individual gifts show an increase this year. I will say arts and education organizations typically have larger staffs and so are likely better at stewardship and cultivation because they simply have more resources, human resources, to devote to that kind of activity. So that means that those smaller environment, animal welfare, human services organizations that have smaller staffs in development a lot of the time are having to work harder at connecting with those donors because of the sheer number of people they have to devote to it. So cultivation is critical. I've mentioned that word a lot of times today already, but cultivation is critical in gaining and retaining those donors. Donors want to see, there's study after study that shows donors want to understand what the return on their investment is. And major donors really are looking at your organizations as investments. So just like anybody else considering an investment would, they want to know what the return on their investment is. And different donors want to see that in different ways. So again, meaningfully engaging donors in your organization, part of that conversation is how are you showing them results? And that may be different for me than it is for Stacy as a donor. She may want to see it one way and I may want to see it another. So again, it's back to your donor and their desires for a relationship with your organization. Our fundraising strategy and tactics need to be more sophisticated than ever before. There are those basic tenets that remain the same in major gift fundraising, but the environment requires stepping it up today. Organizations are having to invest in the tools, the staff, the training to get this job done. And those that are having success are doing that. The Chronicle reported recently some very creative ways that organizations have invested in their fundraising programs and some very successful results that they showed. Government funding is down. Government funding is not going to bounce back anytime soon. We have got to diversify our revenue streams. I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know you all understand that. But if private fundraising is not a big part of your operation, it likely needs to be a bigger part in the future. We can't just research and write more grants. Social media, in terms of reaching out to people. While we have heard good reports of the growth in results, the results have not yet warranted more energy and more resources being spent on social media as a fundraising tool. It's almost the price of entry. We have to have it. We all know we have to have it. Sort of like the website used to be. You had to have one. You had to have a decent one to get in the game. Well, now you have to be on social media, and as we all know, that requires care and feeding in an ongoing way. But you've got to do it. It's just not a primary tool for fundraising. So back to those sources for just a minute. We've talked a lot about individuals, and I talk a lot about it because it is such a big piece of where the money's coming from. Corporate, up 12.2%. In our conversations in the last week since Giving USA has been released, that's gotten a lot of attention. So corporate giving is up 12.2%. Let's talk about that. Why? What do we need to do to address that? And it has. And corporate pre-tax profits, the largest driver of corporate giving, is up. But as Patrick said, the percentage of their profits that they're giving is not up. So if I'm in your shoes, I'm not redirecting my strategy toward corporate giving. And keep in mind more and more that unless your organization and your mission fits with corporate strategic priorities, there's not a reason to spend a lot of energy on that relationship. I'm not saying forget corporate giving. I'm not saying corporations aren't generous. I'm just saying in terms of the piece of the pie, you saw the graph. It's been between 4 and 6% for the last 50 years. Yeah. So between 4 and 6%, this year at 6%. That's not an anomaly. That's not because of the recession. That's where corporate giving is. So I would not readjust my strategy to make corporate giving a priority. In addition to that, recognizing that a large portion of that is gifts in kind. So Giving USA does not break it down into what's given in cash, what's given by gifts in kind, but the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, CECP, does. They track 95, mostly large companies every year. And in that set, 69% of the corporate giving is gifts in kind. If you take out the pharmaceutical companies, still 39% of the giving was from gifts in kind. So a lot of that corporate giving is gifts in kind. Again, I'm not saying you can't use technology or pharmaceuticals, and those are gifts for a lot of organizations, but just to recognize that that's how that's happening. Foundations, up 4.4% as assets continue to recover. Community foundations, up 9.1%. Important to realize that foundations are people too. Foundations require relationships too. You can't just look up guidelines and paper these organizations. Especially if you're talking about community foundations, you probably know these people. Your board members probably know the board members of those organizations. So there's a lot you can do up front to determine, are you going to be a priority for this foundation, and therefore should you proceed? So 46%, just again, a reminder that in that foundation category, 46% of those foundations are private family foundations. So you're likely not talking about grant applications anyway. And if you are, it's not like some of the other grant applications. So again, relationships critical there to the results. Bequests. Patrick mentioned huge swings. He's not going to estimate, or he is going to estimate, but he's going to have a hard time estimating what happens in bequests for the next year, as he does every year. So the more important thing when we talk about bequests, to me and to your organizations, I would say is the opportunity there. It continues to amaze me, the small number of nonprofits who are reminding people that their organizations are potential gift destinations for planned gifts. So if your organization does not yet have a planned giving program, I know that scares people, it intimidates people, but a simple planned giving program based on bequests. I mean, more than 80% of planned gifts are bequests. So reminding people that you are a gift destination for planned gifts will go a long way for future gifts. It may not show up now, but it may in the future potentially transform your organizations. So in conclusion, the pie chart doesn't change much. Those sources remain somewhat the same. Individual giving, 86% of what's giving, corporate giving 6%, and foundation giving 15%. As you move forward, as you take the report, first of all, share the report. Share it with your team. Download the summary, the highlights. Patrick mentioned it, www.givingusareports.org. The summary, the highlights are free. There's more there that you can order if you want to dive into a certain sector, or you want to see the full report, or you want the actual book. There are lots of choices this year. So download that. Share the numbers with your team. We find that people are really interested in this. Obviously, you all are interested in this. Share it with your team. More importantly, maybe more importantly, share it with your board. But help them understand what some of these numbers mean and what they can do with the numbers to help your organization move forward in its fundraising. Giving's up 3.5%. The economic indicators that have a bearing on giving are moving in the right direction. We're talking today about last year's numbers, of course, but those economic indicators that have bearing on giving are continuing to move in the right direction. Last year, we saw increases in some of the key indicators, and we finally saw a change in consumer confidence, which was the last economic indicator we were sort of waiting to see a move in. We finally saw that last year, and happily, we can say that consumer confidence is continuing to move in a positive trajectory this year. So the numbers, in my estimation, are moving in the right direction. Share them, use them as an encouraging tool for your board, but also help interpret them and very clearly communicate how these numbers and your response to them can help build your fundraising program. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. Now we'll hear from Ruth McCambridge, who will talk about what she's hearing from the nonprofit she covers as editor of the Nonprofit Quarterly.
Hello. I'll try to keep this pretty quick. But I think my role here really is to try to put the information from Giving USA together with what we're hearing from numerous other sources, including our community of readers, and try to make it make some sense. Because frankly, you know, the super positive view of, oh, well, you know, we're growing, you know, giving is growing back, is not exactly what we're hearing from our community of readers. And so, you know, last year, I thought it was very funny because one of our readers said, after they saw our report of the Giving USA numbers, which was not a report that says giving is growing, it was a report that says this is going to be a long, slow slog uphill if we're lucky, called Rick and I, Rick Cohen and I, who had put together our article, almost hysterically pessimistic. And, you know, I will agree, we were pretty pessimistic. More pessimistic than other people, but I don't think hysterically so. And in fact, I was telling Patrick this morning that he was saying last year that we were in the second slowest recovery ever, and I said, no, I think it's the first. And it is, in fact, the first slowest recovery ever. Thank you.
Mea culpa.
What we try to do at the Nonprofit Quarterly is to put together multiple pieces of information to try to make sense of what we see happening, and then to try to raise the issues that we think don't make any sense. So let me go through just some of what we found first that we think makes sense, although it hasn't necessarily been put together this way. And I've had some conversations with Patrick around this. I don't think I'm entirely on the wrong track on any of it, but he will certainly say if I am. First of all, the increase in corporate giving. Let me just say about the increase in giving altogether. I want to just highlight the fact that in the first year of the recovery, giving increased 5%. In the second year of the recovery, it increased 1.5%, and this year you're projecting it at 1%. That rate of growth is slowing significantly. We don't know how much further it will slow. And so I'm trusting that Patrick knows what he's doing when he projects out for 6 years. But frankly, I think it might be a little bit optimistic to think that we will get back there in 6 years. Or maybe will we get back there at all? I'm not really sure. There's a rule in systems thinking called limitations of growth. Nothing can grow forever. And so the question is, what are we seeing here? Are we seeing a natural cap on the level of giving? Or are we seeing something else? I want to go on to just talk a little bit about corporate giving, because you could look at the Giving USA report and say, this is the really big news here. Corporations are giving at a significantly higher level. I talk in inflation-adjusted dollars because we spend and take in dollars in terms of their value. So just because I make more this year than I did last year in dollars, it doesn't mean that we can buy the same level of impact. So in inflation-adjusted dollars, the corporations gave 9.9% more, essentially 10% more than they did the year before. or that's what the projections say right now. As Wendy said, a good portion of that was in-kind donations. But what she didn't say is that there's been a significant increase in the in-kind proportion of donations from foundations. And so there is quite potentially less cash coming at the nonprofit sector and more product. And what is the product that's driving that? It is very likely pharmaceuticals, almost certainly. And when you put that together with the increase in health spending, which, as Patrick says, is completely counter tradition. Usually when the government starts giving more in a particular area, it means that people give less. I mean, we're kind of smart that way. We know when the government's giving on our behalf, our tax money, that maybe we can pull back a little bit there and go someplace else. But the fact of the matter is that that giving to health has increased. Well, I wonder how much of that giving is in pharmaceuticals. And as Rick said, Rick wrote a sidebar to our major article this year that looked particularly at the corporate giving. And basically what he said is that, you know, this could very easily be seen as being a ploy to gain market share. That in this development of you know, kind of nonprofits' role in the ACA, that the donation, because we're seeing a difference in the donation to individuals, which in large part was being driven by pharmaceutical donations to individuals. I think more of that now, is my speculation, is going through organizations. And so you see the pharmaceutical companies basically attempting to solidify their market share in what's a burgeoning area, and basically, you know, attend to their bottom line. Again, as and you know, Patrick suggested that I might be hard on the corporations, and I am. We've seen, I think, what is it, 171% growth in profits of corporations since Obama took office, which is essentially the same time period as, you know, we've been dealing with the recession, and not quite that much growth in the level of corporate giving. Also, by the way, not that much growth in wages. I think the growth in wages has been piddly next to that, the corporate giving. And so I would say that if you are looking to the corporate sector for your financing for the next little bit, I would look elsewhere unless you really have a very big pharmaceuticals bill. So my assumptions. Okay, so I think also, like one of the other areas that we've been really interested in is just what's going on in the public benefit area, and I kind of I haunt Patrick about these questions. But public benefit is a weird area that includes federated workplace giving campaigns like United Way's and the Combined Federal Campaign, and it also includes donor advised funds. The United Way's and the Combined Federal Campaigns, of course, gather money in and give it back out in a very short period of time. Is that what donor advised funds do? No, they don't. So people give to donor advised funds. There's a high payout relative to foundations, which only pay out at about 5%, but donor advised funds still pay out only at 14% in a particular year. And so you've got money, more and more money being given into the donor advised funds. As Patrick said, you know, this is an area of very big growth in terms of giving. And you've got more and more money going into those donor advised funds, not being given out within the same year. And so I am, in my simple-minded way, saying there's not as much money circulating. My assumption is, now we know for sure that the Combined Federal Campaign actually saw a reduction last year of 5.2%. It also saw a reduction in givers, individual givers, through their campaign of 10%. That's a really significant reduction. I don't know. I've been having a hard time finding exactly, maybe you know, Patrick, I asked him this question yesterday, finding exactly what the trend has been in United Ways. But my assumption is, given the margin of increase there, that most of the growth in the public benefit and is in donor advised funds, which give out at a lesser, give out less during a period when they've been given to, and also that we probably are looking at, and I don't have the figures on this, but I think it's almost surely so that we are looking at serious trend of reduction in workplace giving campaigns. So that said, I think what we're looking at is actually less money circulating rather than more in cash dollars. We may have more in-kind donations. We may have more money being given into vehicles that are charitable, but they're sitting there. They're sitting there as charitable assets, basically. I think that there's some trade-off in the charitable assets in the donor advised funds and what's being given into foundations at this point. I think that's where there's a little trade-off as well. Okay, so I just want to bring up very, very quickly what I think is the most confounding question for me in the report, because the rest of this stuff I can kind of get to an explanation with some work of what I think may be happening, although some of it is speculation, but I think that it kind of holds together as a rationale. What I can't quite get is what's going on with the arts. Okay, so here's my problem. Actually, last year, the increase that had been projected for the arts, that increase was reduced greatly into a very slight decrease in what was given to the arts in later revisions of the numbers. But even in that, those numbers, Patrick was very clear last year that they were slightly expanded because there was this one major $800 million donation to one museum, and that had expanded the giving to the arts. And so, in fact, we not only saw a reduction last year, but it was even more of a reduction for most arts organizations because of this one major gift. And all of a sudden, we see, boom, that the arts are receiving all of this money. Now, so I want to say this. I don't know what's going on there, and I find it very interesting. I would love to know more about it. I think maybe Patrick will do one of his spotlights on it and try to figure out what the heck went on there. But it is confounding to me, and let me put that, layer that on top of something else. We have been watching arts organizations very carefully over the last year. Or last couple of years. And one of the things that we've seen very clearly is that a lot of the arts organizations in 2007, they were flying high. They basically saw a couple of years of increasing donations, and they decided that they would take on a capital campaign, increase their facilities, increase their, put more money into their performances, do this, do that. They spent to make money. Makes perfect sense, unless the recession happens. And so a lot of arts organizations ended up getting in way over their heads. Some of them are right here in DC, way in over their heads, sometimes in debt with very reduced asset bases. And it may be that all of a sudden people are beginning to see, ooh, we might really lose this one. This might really go away unless we pay into it. But, I don't think that we're going to be looking for a much healthier art sector this year because there is a lot of space to make up in that sector. They got hit really hard just because, in a lot of cases, at least with the larger organizations, they do have to invest to make money in the fees and other kinds of revenue streams that they have. So that's my big question in relationship to all of this. I will say that there are bits and pieces of the rest of this that I'm concerned about. I mean, I look at the health, at the human services category, and one of the things that I noticed is that there's a chunk of that money that actually went directly to Sandy relief. So it wasn't that giving in human services was increased. It very likely was just a tiny bit depressed. Why would I care about this? This is the only reason why I would care. Is because for us, and it's not the only reason why I care very deeply about whether or not nonprofits have the money that they need to work with in front of them. It irks a little bit when you see institutions of higher education doing so well against human services. That doesn't sit well with me personally in my value set. But be that as it may, I really think it's important for nonprofit institutions and the boards of nonprofit institutions to know what it is they're looking at as a fundraising landscape. I don't think the fundraising landscape is coming back in any way the same as it was in 2007. I think we're seeing more in-kind donations, we're seeing more use of donor-advised funds, we're seeing less circulation of the money that is given, the dollars that are recorded as given. So I think that there are different gatekeepers for that money. So I think we're going to have to go at raising that money in new and different ways. And it's going to be kind of an exploration over the next few years how that happens. Some things will stay the same. Some things are going to be very different. So that is my 2 cents. I actually think we're in for a very, very hard but very exciting next 5 years. And I look forward to being able to track all this stuff with you.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you to all of our panelists for excellent observations. I know it's probably prompting tons of questions from all of you. So while we get the microphones going around, I want to ask a quick question. We've talked a lot about the economy's effect on giving, but one of the things that anybody who reads newspapers, looks at websites, looks at television has probably seen over the past few weeks is news about the America's worst charities, and a lack of confidence, certainly, that some donors have in how nonprofits are raising money. Many of you may have seen the report that was a year in the works of rating nonprofits on, in some cases, how little money was actually going to charitable purposes and how much was going to direct marketers and other kinds of folks. Do you think that there's any kind of diminution in confidence that it's not just the economy causing any of these downturns?
So just 2 quick comments. I think that when charities behave badly and that's revealed in the public, there can be a chilling effect across other charities. So there's a contamination, a contagion effect that may be greater than located just to the charities involved. Hopefully those are short-lived and not long-lasting. I think there's another factor in the environment, and just like in the investment sector and the corporate sector, uncertainty creates a more difficult investment opportunity for corporations to invest in plant and equipment and so on. I think uncertainty about the economy and uncertainty about the tax code creates uncertainty in the philanthropic sector. And I think one of the challenges for, we've heard from some of our own donors and donors in general is questions about what's going on with tax policy and what might happen. And so I think that's another aspect besides just the raw economic data that's impacting things today.
I was shocked that nobody had mentioned the charitable tax deduction until this point, so I'm glad you restored my faith that we couldn't get through a panel without talking about taxes. Well, who's got the first question? Right there.
Hi, I'm Catherine Gerber with Youth Service America. And Wendy and Ruth, you had talked a little bit about how nonprofits are going to really think about new and improved ways of how to find funding from, or
Directly.
am I not?
Closer, very close.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Of how we can more effectively get funding from individuals. And I'm wondering if any of you can speak to online giving trends and what we're seeing there and what new ways we really need to be taking advantage of, what tactics we really need to be taking advantage of.
I was actually going to tell this story earlier on. I'm impressed with online giving, not just because it's the source of money, because it's a combined source of money and energy in a lot of cases. And that to me is, you know, when people start asking me about online giving, I remember actually Eli Pariser from Move On telling me this ages ago, like 10 years ago, that it's not about the online giving. It's actually about the online engagement. And what's great about developing those relationships online is that you can keep them vivid with, with some effectiveness over time by a smart use of how that relationship can be developed online. I think one of the things that's been noticed is, for instance, in disaster giving. I mean, the Red Cross has been doing a major study because they're having trouble retaining the disaster givers that give online, that give through text messaging and one thing and another. And the retention then becomes a major issue. I think it's less about the giving and more about the engagement, and that if we can get our heads wrapped around the purpose of nonprofits is to engage community in common purpose around issues they care about, and that part of that is giving, that in fact that's the point. But there was organization, well, it's not even an organization, it was a group of people who wanted to highlight what was going on in Turkey a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, that started on Kickstarter, I think, a crowdfunding campaign for an ad in the New York Times. And so first they did the crowdfunding, very, very successful. Then they asked people to choose between the advertisements that they were going to run. That was very successful. And then they asked people what they wanted to do with the money that was left over. Brilliant. You know what I mean? This says to that group of people, we actually care to have you in our community of action. And around whatever purpose it is, there's something in the development of that relationship that's different and new, and really needs to be explored over the next few years, and is going to change a lot.
I would simply add that online giving, specifically to your question, online giving continues to grow. But when you look at overall, it's only about 10, you hear different numbers, 10, 12% of what's given overall. And multi-channel fundraising, more and more, it's got to be multi-channel. It can't just be one or the other, because what's being given online is a lot of times a result of something you received in the mail or something you saw in another type of campaign. So online can't completely be separated out. I would just say more and more it's important to engage, to create the conversation, and then to have those multiple channels that you're actually asking. If you look at purely where you're seeing the biggest results, then it continues to support investment in major gift fundraising, of course, but recognizing that you have to have those other channels as well.
We just did a special report on online giving that you can find on our website that's got lots of tools that will help you, and we found an overall 14% increase in online donations. But one of the most important things we did was we looked at 22 million gifts and when they were made, and one of the hints I would suggest is that too many people are asking in December, and it's better to look at other times of year, so get those campaigns going now. There's lots of more information about sort of times and ways to go that you can find on our website right now. Who's got the next question?
Can I just say one more thing about this? I have a fundamental disagreement with Wendy that I've said before, is I don't agree with the major gifts focus. I think it's great if you can support your organization partially through major gifts. There are a lot of organizations in this country who cannot do that. And so I think that the emphasis needs to be on both. Some organizations have a lot of access to major gifts and some have not much at all. I don't think a blanket recommendation organization to go after major gifts, no matter whether you're a little soccer organization or a Girl Scout troop or a major university, makes sense to me. So I had to say that.
And I guess I would just add that if you're looking purely at results and where to focus resources, the numbers bear out. I know Little Leagues that have gotten major gifts, I'll just say. So if I'm not talking about a university with a major gift staff, I'm saying any organization, you may not have access to those high net worth individuals as easily. I'm just saying where to allocate your resources where you can have the biggest impact.
I'm Brian Horn from the Council on Foundations, and Wendy mentioned a 9.1% increase in community foundation giving, and I was wondering if you could comment on why you think that is.
Patrick, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think that some of the research that we've done shows that the majority of giving is local giving and regional giving, and I think that community foundations are being more nimble and more entrepreneurial, and they're also creating a lot of donor advice funds. And so the good and the bad of that, depending on your perspective on donor advice funds, is that some of those dollars are going to donor advice funds and community foundations. Again, the payout rate on average is substantially greater than the payout rate of traditional foundations. So maybe that's good news, but at the same time, that's probably the biggest single driver of community foundations.
And Mark Zuckerberg didn't hurt, right?
Right.
Yes, the big gift to the Silicon Community Valley Foundation.
Yeah, $500 million here, $500 million there.
Yeah,
Pretty soon
good.
you're talking about real dollars.
Who's got the next question? Right up there.
Scott Walter at the Capital Research Center. I had a question for Dr. Rooney about this is such a poor recovery in terms of giving. Is the biggest factor in that just the fact that it's on all the economic basics? It's the worst recovery since the Great Depression?
Yeah, I think if you look at philanthropy, I think you have to argue it's still a core American value that 2/3 of Americans give and have continued to give throughout the business cycle. We survey the same 8,000 households every other year and ask them about their giving and volunteering behavior. And what we see is year in and year out, it's between 65 and 70% of regular Americans are giving every year. Wendy mentioned the Bank of America study on philanthropy among high net worth households. In that study, between 95 and 97% of households give every year. So I think the participation rates remain relatively high, but because of changes in household circumstances, particularly economic circumstances, I think that affects how much they give, where they give, and to a lesser degree, why they give.
Hi, my name is Michelle with AC Fitzgerald and Associates. I have a question about bequest giving. Do you think there's any correlation to the estate tax going away for a year and coming back to the number of money that was available to plan gifts?
Yeah, so the estate tax is a tricky thing, right? And one of our estimating charitable bequest giving was complicated enough, and then eradicating the estate tax for a year and then bringing it back is both bad policy, I would argue, but also makes my job a lot more complicated. I do think that this question around the estate tax and its role in society is an important one, and was a good political debate to have in some ways. The best econometric results available, though, do show that if you are interested in fundraising, regardless of your ideological views of the estate tax, you ought to be in favor of having some estate tax, even if it's a relatively high exemption level and lower tax rates than we have today. That from a fundraising perspective, charitable bequest giving is dramatically affected and would go down by as much as a third if we eliminated the estate tax permanently.
Do you have time for one more? Yeah, one. Great. Luke's got the last one. Right there.
Hi, my name's Anders and I'm from Ashoka, and I was just wondering, Wendy, you mentioned that bequests are kind of a low-hanging fruit for nonprofits, but also the donors really enjoy choices. And I was wondering what kind of donor and what kind of organization should be looking to expand their planned giving departments beyond bequests?
To me, the reason it's a low-hanging fruit is just the opportunity. And the reason that I suggest starting with bequest is that typically nonprofits, aside from those in higher ed, maybe those in arts, do not have large plan giving staffs. So the easy place to start is focusing on bequest and on a plan giving program with bequests. If you do have the staff, fine to branch out into some of those other options, but typically those high net worth individuals and those individuals, not just high net worth individuals, because that's not just, high net worth individuals are not the only people making bequests and estate plans that include nonprofits. But typically those people making planned gifts have advisors of their own. So I don't see it as a necessity that a nonprofit needs staff well versed in all the vehicles that a potential donor could choose to leave a planned gift to have a planned giving program. I think start simple and start with bequest.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for these wonderful questions. I want to thank our panelists for giving us so many insights that I think can help fundraising today and in the future. And I'm sure we'll all be available to answer some of your questions in person as this panel concludes. Thank you so much.
Good job, guys.
Well,
I want one of these. I'm sure I can get it online, can I?
no,
Yes.
it's,
Hey,
Thank you.
we're actually
And it's the
coming
one
out
you're
with
giving out today?
Yes.
The one that you referenced?
Yeah.
It would take the whole time, so I was
Oh, can I have one, Tom?
I'm going to disagree with you about this.